Next week, we'll be learning about voting and political participation in Texas. Some takeaways from the lecture: to understand political participation, discuss voter turnout in Texas, including citizens' rights and responsibilities, describe the ways in which the state of Texas has historically restricted access to voting, and describe the forms of political participation other than voting. Political participation. Let's start with political power. This is influence on government based on some combination of numbers of people, wealth, social norms, ideas, force, and violence, and government actions, including laws and regulations. Political participation is defined as all forms of involvement by citizens that can have and are related to governance. Online ways to participate are on the rise. This slide presents the various civil and political participation forms in America. You have those who simply vote, those who volunteer in organizations, those who post comments on political issues online, sign a petition online, encourage others for political action online, attend campaign events or speeches, and those who help organize protests. Which are you? Where do you fall in this chart? Let's take a closer look at political participation. Participation can be conceptualized in terms of levels and types of activities. There are inactives that take no part in politics. They're the ones that I say sit on the sidelines watching a game. Then there are voting specialists that confine their efforts to only voting. There are also parochial participants. These individuals are active when an issue has a direct effect on them. You also have campaigners that enjoy the nature of political campaigns. You have communalists that enjoy nonpartisan, non-controversial community activity. And finally, you have complete activists that are involved at all kinds of level. Here's another view at the different types of political activists. So those who only specialize in voting consist of 20% of the population. Then you have the inactives, the ones that I said that sit on the bleachers on the sidelines and just kind of watch the game. 22% of those in our society. You have parochial participants are 4%. These are the ones where an issue affects them and they're knocking on the office door of their congressperson or county commissioner. You have 15% that are campaigners. These are the individuals that are involved in campaigns, either block walking, making phone calls. Then you have 11% of Americans that are interested in completely immersing themselves in campaigns. Then you have the 7% that are unclassified. We don't know what you do. And then you have communalists that are 20% of the population. Voting in Texas. One of the most common forms of participation is voting in elections. According to the U.S. Constitution, voting cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, sex, failure to pay a tax, or age, provided that you are at least 18 years of age. Historically, there have been poll taxes. This is a tax on citizens that were required to pay each year to be eligible to vote. States still have considerable direction or discretion in who is eligible and in what election system they can vote in. Current voting requirements. Voters in Texas must be at least 18 years of age, citizens of the United States, resident in the state, and registered to vote. Convicted felons and mentally incompetent are excluded. Voter registration is an act of qualifying by formal enrollment on an official list. Voters must be registered at least 30 days before an election, either by paper form or when applying for renewing your driver's license. When registered, voters receive a voter registration card by mail. Voters who move must re-register. Current voting requirements. On election day, voters must present their government-issued photo ID. Individuals who have been unable to obtain one of 7 forms can sign a declaration that they had reasonable impediment to obtaining one, then show an alternative form of identification. A provisional ballot may also be cast. Texas also allows early voting in person or by mail. In absentee voting, early voting mail, voters must request their mail-in ballot, and it must usually be received by 7 p.m. on the date of the election. Ongoing controversies with voting. Advocates of voter ID laws say they reduce voter fraud. Opponents argue they restrict the right to vote. In 2011, when the voter ID laws was passed, Texas was among the states required to obtain federal pre-clearance before the law could go into effect. The U.S. Justice Department denied pre-clearance on the basis that minority groups would be adversely affected. The law went into effect in 2013. However, a section of the Voting Rights Act involved with pre-clearance was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Ongoing controversies with voting. Legal challenges to the voter ID law have continued. There is also controversy over the motor voter law, providing for voter registration when obtaining a driver's license. Voters in 2015 complained their registration applications were not properly processed. A more recent lawsuit has been filed against the state, arguing that differences between online and in-person procedures constitute a violation of prospective voter rights. In March 2018, the U.S. District Court ruled that this disparate treatment violated voter rights. Voter turnout in Texas. There are several ways to calculate voter turnout, the proportion of people who vote in an election. Varying requirements make it difficult to compare turnout rates using the percentage of voter registrations. Voting age population is generally the preferred measure, but it includes a fair number of people who meet the age requirement but are unable to register and vote. A third measure, voting eligible population, is calculated by eliminating ineligible groups from the VAP, but VEP is not universally available at the time. Voter turnout at the national level is lower in the United States than most other industrialized nations. Voter turnout in Texas. In general, Texans are not avid voters. Texas consistently falls below the national average in terms of percentage of VEP in elections of the past 30 years. Texas voters' turnout also ranks at or near the bottom when compared to other states. Note that voter turnout is typically lower for midterm elections than presidential elections. In Texas, as in other states, 2016 saw record-breaking turnout, but Texas's turnout was still low in comparison with other states. A significant number in Texas are not eligible to vote, including ineligible groups, namely non-citizens and convicted felons in Texas. VAP negatively exaggerates the commonly cited turnout levels. Even using VEP, however, voter participation is low. The political culture discourages participation. There is a legacy of restricted access to the ballot. Other social and economic and political factors also play a role. The legacy of restricted ballot access in Texas. Like other southern United States, Texas has a history of restrictive laws that are in keeping with the traditionalistic political culture. Jim Crow laws extended beyond the ballot box to create a racially and ethnically segregated society. In 1902, the Texas legislature adopted a poll tax, which was in effect for about 60 years. After the poll tax was invalidated entirely in 1966, the number of registered voters increased dramatically. Texas still retained a restrictive annual registration system, requiring individuals to register at the county courthouse between October 1st and January 31st. When a 1971 court decision prohibited annual registration systems, Texas adopted a progressive permanent registration system. In the first year, voter registration increased yet again. The legacy of restricted ballot access in Texas under the past practice of many southern states was a white primary. In Texas from 1923 to about 1945, despite numerous Supreme Court challenges, African Americans were prohibited from the Democratic primaries. All white primaries ended with Smith versus Albright in 1944. As in many other states, property ownership was used to restrict the right to vote, especially in local elections. Until the 19th Amendment, women were also disenfranchised in Texas. Rates of participation are affected by socioeconomic factors such as level of education, family income, and minority status. Age also contributes, with younger voters less likely to vote than older voters. Race is another factor. Many minority groups register and vote in smaller proportions than non-Hispanic whites. 2008, 2010, and 2012 were notable exceptions. Voter turnout in Texas in 2018 midterm elections by race. 57.7% of whites, non-Hispanics came out to vote. 48.3% African Americans. Asian Americans were at 39%, and Hispanics of any race were 34.3% likely or came out to turn out to vote in 2018. Felony conviction and voting. Maine and Vermont are the only states that allow felons to vote. Texas prohibits persons convicted of a felony, including those on probation or parole, from voting. Felons may register, however, after they have served out their sentence and completed their time on probation and parole. In 2016, close to 500,000 felons could not vote in Texas. When one examines who makes up those affected by felony disenfranchisement, political power and demographics such as race, ethnicity, class, and gender are linked to lower rates of participation. Party competition and gerrymandering. Lower voter turnout in Texas can also be explained by the lack of party competition. Texans elected Republicans to all state offices from 2002 through 2018 and have solidly been Republican in the United States presidential elections. Party competition and closeness of elections are important factors in voter turnout, with voters more likely to believe their votes will actually count. In competitive districts, both parties have a big incentive to increase voter turnout. Gerrymandering has made for very few truly competitive districts in Texas. Other factors affecting voter turnout. The timing of an election can be significant. Voter turnout is highest in November presidential elections. In Texas, local elections are generally not held in conjunction with general elections. They are commonly held in May. Local elections receive less attention and are not perceived as being important and are often not contested. Days of the week are also important. Tuesday is most common, as in fact that elections are generally held on a single day, particularly for just 12 hours. Rationalist explanation for low voter turnout. Some voters find voting irrational. A single vote is unlikely to be the deciding vote in a large-scale election. The act of voting is not at all valuable relative to the cost, especially in terms of time. Some people may not vote because they are satisfied or are alienated from the political system. And finally, some may be principled non-voters who do not want to give legitimacy to what they see as an illegitimate system. Other forms of political participation. People participate in many other ways. One can be involved intensely by becoming a candidate or superficially by signing a petition. Thanks to the internet, donating to a campaign has become one of the easiest forms of participation. Participation requires free time, expendable income, and political interest. Declining civil involvement may contribute to a loss of social capital, the sense of shared purpose, and the values that social connection promotes. Popular forms of non-voting political participation in Texas. 25% of the population in Texas sign a petition. 17% avoid products for political reasons. 14% contact a politician. 11% purchase products for political reasons. And 11% donate to political causes. What do you do, I wonder? So the takeaways. Texas has chronically low levels of voter turnout and participation in the political process in general. Many factors influence political participation. Texas has relatively strict requirements for voting, and Texas, along with other southern states, has a legacy of restricting access to the ballot. The current low levels of participation are consistent with the state's traditionalistic political culture.